last part of my lecture today, I'd like to share with you some of my own views about the connection between love and education. And in some ways, my views converge, and in other ways, they diverge from those of Plato. So, like Plato, I believe that education thrives when a certain type of fervor, let's call it a studious fervor, catches hold of a person. And like Plato, I believe that good teachers educe such fervor in the self and direct it toward something that lies beyond the self. I also believe, like Plato, that love responds to the beautiful, and that the beautiful often reveals itself to and through our understanding. The honeycomb of a beehive becomes more beautiful when one understands the hexagon in its formal definition as an equilateral and equiangular form that is bicentric, a form that is both cyclic and tangential. And here you all know that a beehive, the honeycombs of the beehive have the hexagonal form. Now, my views diverge from Plato in two important ways. First, I believe that reading and writing play a far more essential role than Plato allowed for. The living converse between teacher and student is crucial, I don't deny that. But I believe that books are often the best teachers and that they have a singular power to reach into that quiet, inward place that Plato called the soul. I believe furthermore that words in a book can be every bit as animate, if not more animate, than the words spoken in classrooms, seminars, or symposia. Now, my views about love and education diverge from Plato in another, more important respect. Now, for Plato, the ultimate goal of education is to direct the student's love toward transcendent truth and wisdom. And Plato's wisdom was, in many ways, at odds with both the human world and the natural world. For Plato, the natural world is deficient, it lacks true being, while the human world traffics in ignorance, false opinions, and folly, for the most part, or so Plato believed. Thus, for education purposes, the teacher's job for Plato is to lead to knowledge of a higher order of reality than the one that informs our human world. And I see it differently. I believe in worldly truth, not unworldly truth. And for me, education fulfills its most crucial mandate by promoting in the student an unconditional commitment to the world that existed before he or she was thrown into it, and that will outlast his or her passage through it. This commitment to the world, this amor mundi, or love of the world, as the political theorist Hannah Arendt called it, does not come naturally. It has to be learned through a process of taking ownership of something that at first does not seem to belong to you at all, namely the human world in its political, social, economic, and cultural institutions. I leave the natural world aside here for the moment. Amor mundi, love of the world, comes into being when the self-affection of a young person undergoes a metamorphosis, expanding beyond the self in which it has its source toward the world in which it finds its purpose. Now, young love is by nature idiosyncratic and world-shy. Who has not felt as freakish and isolated in one's youth as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? And who cannot hear some personal resonance in the verses that open Edgar Allan Poe's poem, Alone? From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone. Now, the role of education as I see it is to submit this uncommon spring of self-affection to a maturation process and to mobilize it on behalf of the common world that binds the citizens of a polity together as a plurality. The uncommon spring that Poe refers to is what ultimately separates one person from another. Without the uncommon differences that distinguish one person from another, the world that comes between men, as Hannah Arendt calls it, the world is that which comes between men, that without these uncommon differences, this world would not have plurality as one of its basic constituents. The world is the locus of plurality because each of us, as citizens, is a first-person singular. Now, the young have necessarily an ambivalent relation to the world. You are thrown into it without having chosen it or built it, yet you are destined to inherit it for better or for worse. Thus, you have to learn how to take ownership of it, how to assume responsibility for it, and how to love it insofar as it is your world, whether you have chosen it or not. This is the difficult but fundamental task of education as I see it. Now, for world love to take root in a student, he or she must acquire a basic knowledge of how it came to be. When history's conflicted and stratified past begins to inform the student's cognizance of the present, that student's relation to time, to his or her being in time, undergoes a maturation process. The more the present reveals itself as the outcome of the past, the more it also appears as the incubator of its future, as the parent of its future, if you want to use that metaphor. Education does not fulfill its worldly mandate by putting an electronic device in every student's hand, nor by promoting a purblind vision of the present, but by plunging students into the depths of history and pushing them toward those subterranean regions where the dead speak in their own untimely voices and where the past opens up like a landscape of future possibilities. In the John Williams novel I mentioned earlier, Professor Sloan recites a poem of Shakespeare in class and then looks at Stoner. Mr. Shakespeare speaks to you across 300 years, Mr. Stoner. Do you hear him? Well, do we hear him? Do we hear the call of legacies? Legacies call out to us from the past. They call out for adoption, retrieval, and renewal. I am tempted to say that there are certain legacies that actually love you, that court your devotion, if only because without you, they have no life of their own. Have you ever felt loved or courted by a legacy? Well, now is the time to let it happen during these years of your university education. Now, a century ago, the Sri Lankan philosopher Ananda Coomaraswamy wrote, I quote, "We are called from the past and make our home in the future, but to understand, to endorse with passionate conviction, and to love what we have left behind is the only possible foundation for power." Again, love of the world is engendered first and foremost by understanding how the world in its present historical reality came to be. We must learn the idiolects of the dead. That is why it is important for education to resist the siren calls of the contemporary and keep open the dimension of the untimely. Since we make the future only out of what has been bestowed, education's first order of business is to foster the conditions that make bestowal take place. In his book, Matter and Memory, the French philosopher Henri Bergson defined living memory as, quote, "the synthesis of past and present with a view to the future." In its ideal, education sponsors a living memory of this sort. Now, it requires a great deal of world love, of amor mundi, to take the well-being of the world to heart and commit yourself to assuring that it doesn't fall to pieces on your watch. It is that love alone that takes custody of the world's future. Wherever it comes from, we need a lot more of it in our world today. To put it in a final sentence, education teaches you to love, not yourself, but the world that made you possible and that depends on you for its future.